You are welcome to this section, and the topic that we'll be discussing is a review of the physiology of menstruation and menstrual cycle. I'm Dr. Rahim, Zanab. I'm a consultant obstetrician gynecologist. At the end of this lecture, you should be able to understand the concept of menstruation and also have a good grasp of the events of the menstrual cycle, and at the same time acquire the knowledge of the control of menstruation. The reproductive system undergoes cyclical changes in preparation for fertilization and pregnancy. The most obvious feature of these events is the cyclical vaginal bleeding that occurs with the shedding of the endometrium, which is known as the menstruation. The menstrual cycle takes about 28 plus or minus 7 days, with the menstrual flow lasting for 5 plus or minus 3 days, with an average blood loss of 20 to 80 mils. We should note that this variation in the length of the menstrual cycle has a mean, which is about 28 days, and that is seen in 15% of the female population. By convention, the first day of the vaginal bleeding is considered as the day 1 of the menstrual cycle. The menstrual blood is majorly arterial, with about 25% venous in origin. Then it contains tissue debris, prostaglandins, mucus, and fibrinolysin, which prevent the menstruum from clotting, except the fibrinolytic system is overwhelmed. The process of menstruation shows beyond reasonable doubt that the hypothalamus, the ovary, and the uterus are perfectly functioning. Any interruption along these ordered axes leads to menstrual disorder. A good understanding of the menstrual cycle regulation is important in treating different menstrual cycle disorders. Now we go to the events, which can also be taken as the cycles, and I'll be discussing the uterine events first. How the events that take place in the uterus result in the menstrual flow, in as much as there is no fertilization. Under the influence of estrogen that is secreted by developing follicles, the endometrium regenerates from the deep layer, which is called the stratum basalis, resulting in increase in the thickness of the endometrium during the menstrual cycle. We should actually try to recap that the endometrium is divided into two layers, which is the superficial and the deep layer. The deep layer is the stratum basalis, while the superficial layer is divided into the stratum compactum and also the stratum spongiosum. As the thickness increases, the glands are drawn out so that their length increase. These changes are called proliferative changes, and it results in terming the first phase of the endometrial cycle, the proliferative stage. It is also called the pre-ovulatory phase or the follicular phase. Following ovulation, under the influence of both estrogen and progesterone, which is produced by the corpus luteum, the endometrium becomes highly vascularized and edematous, with the glands being coiled and tortuous, with the secretion of clear fluid into the endometrial cavity. These changes result in the term secretory or luteal phase of the menstrual cycle. This is actually a pictorial representation of the events of the endometrium. It will be noticed that at the initial phase of the menstrual cycle, this is where the menstruation occurs. There is shedding of the layers of the endometrium. Following this shedding, there is increase in the proliferative changes that occur. The layers are increasing in thickness, and the glands are also increasing in sizes. At this point, for a 28-day cycle, it's expected that ovulation takes place on day 14. After ovulation, under the influence of estrogen and progesterone, the endometrium undergoes changes depicted in this picture, vis-a-vis the increase in the tortuosity of the glands, then also the layers are also edematous. Then histologically, we could find the vacuoles that secrete fluid into the endometrial cavity at the part of the layers that is close to the cavity. Hence, the ease with which they secrete the fluid into the cavity. Then it will be noticed that after all these changes, in the absence of fertilization, the endometrium sheds, and this is the beginning of another menstrual cycle. With the regression of the corpus luteum, hormonal supply to the endometrium is ceased, and there is vasospasm of the long curved spiral arteries of the functional layer of the endometrium. This results in ischemia. The stroma of the endometrium is infiltrated by leukocytes, and this initiates the breakdown of the extracellular matrix. Focal area of necrosis appear in the walls of the spiral artery and that of the endometrium. All these coalesce and they become confluent, resulting in menstrual flow. Let's quickly take a look at the development of a follicle. First, there is the primordial follicle. And this primordial follicle is actually the oocyte that is surrounded by a single layer of granulosa cells. Then we should also remember that this oocyte is arrested at the diplotin stage of the first meiotic division. Diplotin stage is one of the phases of the prophase in meiosis. Following further development, the primary follicle is formed. The primary follicle is actually the oocyte that is surrounded by a single layer of granulosa cell, the basement membrane, and the thicker cells. This also transforms into the secondary follicle, which is also called the preantral follicle. And that is the oocyte that is surrounded by the zona pellucida, several layers of granulosa cells, and also several layers of the thicker cells. Then there is development into the tertiary follicle or the antral follicle. At this stage, the secondary follicle will have acquired a cavity from accumulated fluid, and that cavity is the antrum. In the process, the oocyte is positioned eccentrically and surrounded by granulosa cells. These granulosa cells surrounding the oocyte at this stage is termed the cumulus euphorus. The discussion of the menstrual cycle will be incomplete without discussing the ovarian event, because the ovary release the hormones that are very key in the control of the menstrual cycle. At birth, there are many primordial follicles under the capsule of the ovary. And we should also remember that in the process of the development of the fetus, at 20 weeks, the ovary has about 6 to 7 million primordial follicles. At the beginning of each menstrual cycle, several follicles are recruited, and in the process, they acquire a cavity, which is the antrum, that is filled with clear fluid. The dominant follicle outgrows the other follicles, and these other follicles, they become atretic. The dominancy of one follicle during the follicular phase of the menstrual cycle is related to the amount of estrogen that is produced by this follicle, and the proximity of the follicle to blood supply favors high gradients of exposure to hormones and growth factors, and these in turn make this follicle to be dominant. Dominancy is actually seen as early as the 6th day of the menstrual cycle. The wall of a mature follicle is actually consists of different layers. This layer is made up of the granulosa cells, the theca internal cells, the theca external cells, and all of these enclose the clear fluid in the antrum. As earlier said, about 7 million germ cells are present in both ovaries at 20th week of fetal life. But at birth, about 200 millions would be present as a result of involution of most cells that were initially formed. These cells will have undergone atresia. All these cells, they undergo the first meiotic division, and they are arrested at the prophase stage of the first meiotic division, precisely the diplotin stage, and they remain like that till adulthood. At puberty, there are about 300,000 primordial follicles as a result of continuous atresia that takes place as development continues in the reproductive life. And only 400 to 500 of these eggs mature during the entire reproductive life of a female. The first meiotic division is only completed once ovulation is about to occur, and this results in the formation of a secondary oocyte, which is one of the daughter cells that receive the most of the cytoplasm. And the second cell is called the first polar body, and this degenerates. The secondary oocyte starts the second meiotic division, which is arrested at the metaphase stage till fertilization occurs. And this arrest is possible by the secretion of a substance that is called the oocyte maturation inhibitor. With increased growth of the dominant follicle, there is increase in the secretion of the estrogen, and this causes a positive feedback effect on the anterior pituitary gland, resulting in the luteinizing hormone surge commonly called the LH surge. And we should remember that this LH surge takes place about 36 to 40 hours prior to ovulation. Around the 16th day of the menstrual cycle, usually the 14th day for a 28-day menstrual cycle, the growing distended dominant follicle ruptures, releasing its ovum into the abdominal cavity. This process is what is termed ovulation. The fimbrial end of the uterine tubes picks up the released ovum and it is transported into the uterus. In the absence of fertilization, the ovum either degenerates or it passes out of the uterus through the vagina. The leftover ruptured follicle is filled with blood, resulting in what is called the corpus hemorrhagicum. The bleeding from this ruptured follicle could also track into the abdominal cavity, causing peritoneal irritation, leading to what is called the mid-cycle pain or the Mittelschmerz. The granulosa cells and the thicker cells subsequently proliferate, and the clotted blood in the ruptured follicle is replaced with yellowish lipid-forming luteal cells, resulting in what is called the corpus luteum. This is the luteal phase of the menstrual cycle, and this corpus luteum produces the estrogen and the progesterone. In the absence of menstruation, the corpus luteum degenerates within the next 14 to 16 days. If pregnancy, however, occurs, the corpus luteum persists. And if no pregnancy, it degenerates into a fibrous tissue like material, which is called the corpus albicans. This degeneration begins on the 24th day of the menstrual cycle. Because of this degeneration, progesterone supply ceases, and the support to the endometrial lining is withdrawn, and this results in the sloughing off of the functional layer of the endometrium, and this indicates the start of another menstrual cycle. Remember that it's only the functional layer of the endometrial lining that is sloughed off, leaving the basal layer behind, from which the process that culminates in menstruation starts in the next cycle. This picture shows us a cross-section of the ovary, showing the different events that take place during the development of the follicle. As seen here, this is the primordial follicle, usually small because it contains just the oocyte and a single layer of the granulosa cells. With further growth, there is increase in the size of the primordial follicle. There is accumulation of fluid in the antrum. There is also increase in the layers of the surrounding granulosa cells and thicker cells, resulting in what is called a mature follicle. Here is the layer of the granulosa cell surrounding the oocyte, This is what is called the cumulus ovorus. Before leaving this part, there is an insert that is shown here. This is showing us the different layers of the wall of the mature follicle. As you can see, from inside out, this is the follicular fluid of the antrum, followed by the granulosa cell layers. In between the thicker cell layer and the granulosa cell layer, histologically there is the presence of the basement membrane. And the thicker cell layer is actually made up of the theca interna and the theca externa. These mature follicle, at the point where it's ready for ovulation, it can also be termed a Gravian follicle. Following ovulation, which has taken place at this point, this is the ovulated oocyte, and this is the ruptured follicle that is left behind, with blood filling its cavity, and subsequently called the corpus hemorrhagicum. With the proliferation of the granulosa cell layers and the thecal cell layers, and also the change in the blood cells occupying the cavity into the yellowish lipid-laden luteal cells, the young corpus luteum is birthed. With subsequent growth, there is the matured corpus luteum. However, in the absence of fertilization, the corpus luteum starts to regress. At the end of the day, it forms the fibrous, it acquires fibrous tissue and becomes the corpus albicans. The menstrual cycle is under the influence of the hypothalamus pituitary ovarian axis. The follicle stimulating hormone is important in the recruitment of the follicles at the beginning of the menstrual cycle, and it also stimulates the aromatase activity in the granulosa cells, which helps in the conversion of androgens to estrogens, predominantly the active one, which is the estradiol. The estrogen works synergistically with the follicle stimulating hormone to induce both the follicle stimulating hormone and the luteinizing hormone receptors in the granulosa cell and the thicker cells of the growing follicle. And this plays a central role in the growth of the follicle. The luteinizing hormone is involved in the release of the matured ovum vis-a-vis the LH surge, which takes place prior to ovulation. It increases the uptake of cholesterol and low-density lipoproteins by the thicker cells for the formation of androstenedione and testosterone, which are subsequently aromatized in the granulosa cells. Progesterone is responsible for the progestational changes in the endometrium, which support the fertilized ovum in case pregnancy occurs. And it has anti-estrogenic effect on the myometrium, reducing the cellular excitability of the myometrial cells and also the sensitivity of the myometrial cells to oxytocin. This picture tells us about the two-cell theory of ovarian steroidogenesis. This was first proposed by Falk in 1959, And the basic thing about this theory is two different cells, which are the thicker cells and the granulosa cell, producing two hormones, which are the androstenedione and the estradiol, which is involved in the process of menstruation. Taking a look at the thicker cells, we would see the luteinizing hormone receptor on the thicker cells and the follicle stimulating hormone receptor on the granulosa cell. These are usually expressed during the late part of the antral stage of the follicle. Following their expression, we would see that there is a protein here, which is the cytochrome P17. And this cytochrome P17, the gene is expressed only in the thicker cell. And the end product of this gene expression produces the enzyme, which is the rate limiting, this particular part is the rate limiting step. The enzyme is the rate limiting enzyme in the process of conversion of pregnenolone to androstenedione. Following the production of androstenedione, there is diffusion into the granulosa cell via the basement membrane. This thick red line indicates the basement membrane, and this diffuses into the granulosa cell. The granulosa cell is equipped with aromatase enzyme, which subsequently converts the androstenedione into estradiol. And this estradiol is transferred into the blood, and from there, part of it is also secreted into the antrum. So this process, this two-cell theory, tells us about the interplay between the thicker cell and the granulosa cell in a bid to maintain the supply of estrogen, which is very key in the process of menstruation. This picture actually shows us a synchronization of the events of the uterine, of the endometrium, and also the ovary. We actually can also see the anterior pituitary hormone being displayed. At the beginning of the menstrual cycle, there is increased secretion of estradiol under the influence of the follicular stimulating hormone. There is recruitment of the ovarian follicle. Following recruitment, there is selection, which is also known as the dominancy subsequently. And here, the concentration of the estradiol increases, and it gets to a point where it causes the LH surge. This is actually the LH surge. As previously said, the LH surge takes place 36 to 40 hours prior to the onset of ovulation. But the peak of the LH surge takes about 9 to 10 hours before the main event of ovulation. Ovulation subsequently takes place. Formation of corpus luteum, release of progesterone, which sustains the endometrial lining, and in the absence of fertilization, there is formation of the corpus albicans. We should also remember that apart from the hormones that are involved in the regulation of the menstrual cycle, There are also some paracrine substances which are also very important, and these include the prostaglandin, and they have a very profound effect on the menstrual cycle. Prostaglandins E and F are present in high concentrations in the endometrium. Prostaglandin F2 alpha and prostaglandin E2 both of them cause myometrial contraction. Prostaglandin F2 alpha, however, causes vasoconstriction, while prostaglandin E2 causes vasodilatation. This prostaglandin E2 also leads to increased pain and edema during the process of the menstrual cycle. Vasoconstriction leads to localized tissue hypoxia, and this further reinforces the release of inflammatory mediators. These result in the spiral arterioles getting constricted, and also the contraction of the uterine muscle. All these lead to expulsion of the menstruum. A delicate balance is maintained between the ratio of prostaglandin F2 alpha and prostaglandin E2 alpha. Any alteration in this balance or in this ratio actually leads to menorrhagia and other menstrual disorders, including dysmenorrhea. In conclusion, the menstruation is the visible manifestation of cyclical physiologic uterine bleeding due to the shedding of the endometrium as a result of interplay of hormones through the hypothalamo-pituitary ovarian axis, also known as the HPO axis. Alteration in this axis leads to disordered menstruation. Thank you for listening.